There are dozens of cutlery steels, probably more than 100, but some are much more popular than others according to their properties to design blades adapted to the required use. In the field of folding knives, also called pocket knives or EDC, there are a dozen steels that are frequently found on models offered by manufacturers. In this video we will review the most used steels in the cutlery industry for the manufacture of folding knife blades and see the main characteristics of these steels. To illustrate the video, there will be images of various commercial pocket knives and a legend specifying the model and type of steel will appear. To draw up the most objective possible assessment of the use of steels in the production of folding knives, I carried out some calculations. I went to the site of a famous online shop, Knives and Tools, and I edited a spreadsheet from the 3,843 references of folding knives present on their website for a total of 72 brands, a sample broadly representative of the market and in particular of the offer. From these data I obtained percentages in order to have a good view at the types of steel most used by brands. The sample remains representative because the brands absent from the calculation also use the most common steels. It is important to take into account the overrepresentation of certain steels used almost exclusively by certain brands which have many models, such as Victorinox, whose Swiss knives are made of 1.4110 steel and not particularly representative of folding knives since their products are mainly multifunction knives. This is why steel 1.4110 appears in third position thanks to the 293 Victorinox models composed of this steel and present on the site at the time of my calculation. This is also the case for the Case brand and its True Sharp steel, which I did not know but which appears in 8th position with 154 models. To do this well, we could even assign a coefficient which would, for example, be equivalent to the number of brands using a type of steel to better perceive the popularity of certain alloys. To refine, we could also group together certain steels which are very similar in terms of composition. Some trends are clearly emerging. Thus in 2021 the steel most used by manufacturers is D2 with, according to the quantities observable on the Knives and Tools internet site, 377 models for 20 brands including 72 best etch knives, 57 Civivi, 50 steel will. In second position we may be surprised to find the high-end M390 steel with 335 knives divided into 21 brands including 56 MKM models and 40 best etch models. CPMS 35VN steel comes in the top 3 with 284 models for 22 brands. This graph allows us to observe the distribution of the most used steels. These 12 steels represent 57.8% of the production of folding knives. High-end steels such as M390, CPM20CV and CPMS 35VN alone represent nearly 20% of the models sold. Here are the top 7 steels according to the manufacturer's offer. These are the most widely used steels today. The numbers correspond to market shares expressed as percentages. Let us now see what are the properties of these steels. Before I started this YouTube channel on knives, I did a lot of research. I established tables, comparisons and cross-checks of data in order to obtain the most reliable information possible. I noticed that on the evaluation of the properties of steels there was contradictory data. I therefore also based myself on the composition of the steels to try to validate certain information. If steels often have very complex and different names, they are sometimes quite similar in terms of the proportion of elements. But it should be kept in mind that many parameters can intervene in the process of obtaining steel. Small variations in the proportions of various elements can have a great influence on the properties of steel. For example, the addition of niobium, a metal of which there are very few deposits in the world, makes it possible to increase the wear resistance of the alloy and its impact resistance. CPMS 35VN steel has a content of 0.5% niobium, there is 0.7% in Nilox and its proportion reaches 3% in CPMS 110V steel. What we can say for simplicity is that the formulation of a steel is ultimately like a cooking recipe. It is necessary to measure certain ingredients well and not to carbonize everything when cooking. Thus, the hardening step, which is a heat treatment, is decisive for optimizing the properties of the steel, guaranteeing its homogeneity and its mechanical resistance. It is during this delicate step that the cohesion of the alloy takes place. We know that often in the field of physics and chemistry tiny variations have very great effects. This is perhaps why brands do not communicate much about the properties of steels. Even the HRC Hardness Index, Rockwell Index, is often given in a range, because it can vary with different batches of steel production. It is quite understandable to sometimes have conflicting opinions about steels because there are properties that are difficult to assess. For example, the assessment of edge retention is not based on any standard, and the methods for assessing it are quite subjective. If we take the criterion of robustness or solidity of a steel, it is a bit like wanting to compare the resistance of oak compared to bamboo. In fact, according to certain uses, a type of steel will withstand the stresses and forces exerted on it well. Flexibility can be an advantage in some cases. Steel bends but does not break. Very hard steel will tend to retain its sharpness but may suddenly break or chip. The impact resistance of a metal is also called resilience. The strength of a steel is often a matter of compromise, and some qualities are antagonistic. It is thus difficult to define or compare with precision the properties of steels with respect to each other. We can, however, give the main properties of a steel with the graphs that I am presenting to you, but which are to be taken as an indicator and not an absolute truth. What then are the properties required for a folding knife blade steel? The resistance of a folding knife blade steel is less important than that of a fixed blade knife, which in use will be subjected to greater stress. A folding knife by design has brittle points that will theoretically break before the blade, although exceptions are possible depending on the quality of the materials, including their ability to deform without breaking. The preservation of the cutting edge is a very important criterion for folding knives, generally considered as EDC, acronym for everyday carry. That is to say that one carries and uses daily to cut wire, open a box, or prepare to eat. So it's the kind of knife that needs to stay sharp for a long time and that you don't want to be forced to sharpen too regularly. The harder steels generally have an excellent propensity to retain their sharpness, but they can be brittle and are very difficult to sharpen. If your main criterion for choosing a knife is its aesthetics, design, beauty, and quality of workmanship, then it is better that its blade is formed of stainless steel, which will ensure that its overall appearance is preserved over time. Note that we are talking here about resistance to corrosion in domestic environments, contact of the knife with fresh water, organic matter such as food, or fruit acids. There are varying degrees of corrosion resistance. Some steels can resist strongly corrosive acids or in contact with salt water such as H1 steel. But generally this extreme resistance to corrosion comes to the detriment of the retention of the cutting edge. The maintenance of a folding knife is, however, less simple than a knife with a fixed blade, because water, humidity, can get in the gaps, under the plates, in the axis. Therefore a stainless steel has a definite advantage. Paradoxically, as we have seen previously, it is currently D2 steel which is the most used for the manufacture of folding knives. There are indeed a lot of very pretty folding knives, mainly of Chinese origin, in D2 steel. However, the steel is sensitive to oxidation. This choice of steel is probably explained by the fact that D2 is a hard steel that retains its sharpness well, and that it is one of the main criteria of choice for folding blades. Folding knives are tools that you may need unexpectedly, like an opinel, a knife that we no longer present. Or just as a reminder, the opinels are folding knives made in France since 1890. The Fiberglass safety ring was invented in 1955, giving the characteristic appearance of this knife that we all know. Its particularly sharp XC90 carbon steel blade is easily sharpened but is highly sensitive to rust. It needs to be maintained by drying and greasing if we do not want to see it become darker and oxidize. This is, for example, the state of the blade after cleaning it with a disinfectant based on citrus juice. The oxidation reaction cannot be made to wait. The traces of rust appear in a few minutes. But the carbon steel opinel is nonetheless extremely sharp. It is also important to remember that rust is only iron oxide and that we can continue to cut food without risk to health because it is not toxic. The design of this knife is consistent. The beechwood handle is a rustic, natural material which also ages like the blade will acquire a patina. When you buy a carbon steel opinel, you acquire a timeless traditional knife and you accept to have a blade that will change more or less in appearance over time. But now Panel also offers models with polyamide fiberglass handles resistant to shocks, water and extreme temperatures, and stainless steel blade, a combination for fans of knives not very sensitive to the outside elements. If the purpose of the knife is above all to be abused, then cheap carbon steel will not pose a problem and prove to be formidable in efficiency. If you prefer a knife that will keep its original appearance, then stainless steel will offer a much better guarantee. Moreover, the vast majority of high-end folding knives have a stainless steel blade. Multifunctional knives represent a category of pocket knives apart. Most Swiss knives have a 1.4110 steel blade. Swiss multipurpose knives are essentially made of 1.4109 steel, also called 440A. The blade of these multifunction knives, as well as all their steel accessories, are above all intended for occasional use. The steel is therefore not as high-end as on more specific knives or tools. It is also to limit the price of these knives that manufacturers have opted for cheap but nevertheless effective steels. We note that for high-end folding, the most popular steels are M390 and CPMS35VN, powder technology steels, which have excellent characteristics. Powder technology makes it possible to obtain a very homogeneous steel, with a very fine structure. The blades are particularly incisive. The M390 offers exceptional retention of its cutting edge, but it has the drawback of its quality by being therefore quite difficult to sharpen. It will take a lot of energy to achieve this with the right equipment. It also offers perfect corrosion resistance. The CPMS35VN is probably currently the ideal steel for high-end cutlery, because it is good on all criteria. It is stainless, resistant, keeps its edge well while sharpening without too much difficulty. The cost of this steel is quite high-end, as the CPMS35VN blades are often combined with materials like titanium and carbon fiber to make up the handle. We are often dealing with models that exceed $200. Here is a graph which presents a breakdown of the main steels used for the manufacture of folding knife blades according to their corrosion resistance and their move-up market. We start with 420HC type stainless steels, 8CR13 MOV, 14C28N and 12C27, 440C and 9CR18 MOV. In a higher price range, the VG10 and N690 Co are very good steels. Then come the high-end steels from powder technology, such as the very popular CPMS35VN and the CPMS30V. Finally, the highest steels of range in particular because of their sharpness are the CPMS90V, the CPM20CV and the M390. D2 is a bit lonely due to its lower resistance to corrosion, but in terms of other properties it is on par with the most high-end steels. So which steel is better? If for you a high price is not dissuasive, then you will appreciate the CPMS35VN and the M390, which offer stainless steel and above all an excellent retention of the cutting edge. If you want a cheap knife model with stainless steel, 14C28N and 12C27 steels are safe values like 8CR13 MOV, a fairly similar composition. The VG10 and N690 are also very popular for their good edge retention and their ability to resist rust, but in higher price ranges. Finally, if you are not too careful about the visual aspect of the blade over time, the D2 is essential because of the huge choice of models with an excellent value for money. There are dozens of other cutlery steels used to make folding knife blades. The variations in properties are sometimes hardly perceptible, apart from the resistance to oxidation, which is easily observable. As it is difficult to have the possibility of testing steels, it is always interesting to know their composition. Steels have as main component iron, but also carbon for hardness and sharpness, chromium and molybdenum to increase corrosion resistance, cobalt, tungsten to increase hardness, vanadium to increase impact resistance, even to give a little elasticity to the blade. For example, know that stainless steel is an iron alloy with a certain proportion of chromium in relation to its carbon content. In general, steels with a chromium content greater than 13% and less than 1% carbon are stainless. If the carbon content exceeds 1%, then more chromium and molybdenum will be needed to guarantee resistance to oxidation. There is no such thing as perfect steel, there are always compromises on different properties. Steel that retains its sharpness will logically be more difficult to sharpen. Very hard steel, with a high carbon or high cobalt content that resists wear, may be more brittle in an impact. A rather flexible steel and thus resistant to breakage will not retain its sharpness. Corrosion resistance is quite relative and depends on the corrosive substance and the contact time. The steels which are the most marketed today are good steels which have proved their worth. The most expensive steels are those which retain their sharpness the best. It's up to you to choose according to your budget, your preferences and the use for which your knife is intended. Hope you enjoy this video. Feel free to give your opinion in the comments and subscribe and like to support the channel.